You then even come up with metrics that maybe are hard to measure, but you say this would be the most powerful metric. And then you can go back and sort of deconstruct it and say, can I come up with a proxy for that metric? Can I come up with something that is a leading or lagging indicator around that metric?
If there was one piece of advice you could give to product leaders who are struggling to find the right balance between data and narrative in their decision making, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for another PITT session. That's Product Innovation Think Tank, User Pilot's collaborative magazine where product leaders share their real-world insights. I'm super excited about today's topic because it's something we all struggle with. How to make sense of all those metrics while not losing sight of the actual people using our products. We often find ourselves navigating between cold, hard metrics and rich, complex user stories, right? So, how do we know when to trust the numbers and when to listen to the narrative? This tension is something all product teams face, regardless of their industry or company size. And today, I get to chat with Ibrahim Bashir, who wrote a really good article about this exact challenge. I dropped the link of the article in the chat, so if you didn't check yet, you can check out the article now. Ibrahim has been in the product trenches for decades and has some great takes on finding that sweet spot between data and stories. Hello, Ibrahim. Welcome back to PITT.
Hey, Lucine. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks. I'm really glad to have you here again. If it's okay, I want to start the questions right away.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so Ibrahim, in your article, you talked about product leaders being stuck between measuring everything and going with the gut feeling. Why is this such a headache for so many of us, and how do you deal with it? How do you find this right balance?
Yeah, I guess I'd start with, the desire to measure everything comes from almost failing to choose what is the focus area, what is the priority. When you're equivalently looking at all parts of your product, all features, all metrics, you're basically saying everything matters the same. But the reality is, in most products, there are certain screens, certain flows, certain experiences that matter an order of magnitude more than others, right? For example, the onboarding setup experience might be the most critical thing for users as they get ramped up into your product. That needs to be rock solid. And so when you're sort of worrying about an upsell screen or something that only power users use, you're kind of not really focused on the priority. So one is, I think when people have a tendency to measure everything, it's a failure of choice. The second is, how do I actually go with my gut versus use data? I think it's important to understand there are decisions where you need accuracy and there are decisions where you just need to be going in the right direction, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think, so much product philosophy and product best practices are based around consumer products that are built and scaled in a particular way where there's a lot of data precision and a lot of experimentation. People try to apply that logic to every product decision. And a lot of times you just need directional clarity. You don't need precision. And so that's another thing I look for is speed of decisions more important or is accuracy of decision more important? Because when accuracy is more important, yes, you should absolutely get to the nth level of data and you should argue for accuracy. But if you just kind of need to know, hey, should we continue to move forward in this direction or not, a simple binary, then qualitative feedback, something more high level will suffice.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that tension in my own work because sometimes the data tells you one story, but your experience and intuition are like screaming something else. And it reminds me of when we were tracking customer onboarding completion rates at my previous company, and the numbers were looking like great, over like 90% completion rate. But when we actually spoke with customers, we discovered many were just clicking through to get rid of the prompts without absorbing any information. So the metric looked perfect while the actual experience was like failing. So this seems to be a universal challenge across different business functions. And the most successful product decisions often come from respecting both signals. And it reminds me of this saying that not everything that counts can be counted. And I think on that idea of balance, do you think product teams should hire for diversity in thinking styles? Like perhaps some people who are more analytical and others who are more like intuitive, or should every product manager strive to develop like both skill sets equally?
I mean, the answer, at least my perspective, is both. For example, I think you have to hire people who have superpowers in one dimension or the other, but then I think you have to coach them to become more balanced over time. So there is definitely value in people who can think intuitively, right? Who can take bits and pieces and connect the dots in ways that are maybe harder for data or analysts to see. But then you also need people with a real quantitative mindset to make sure they know how to optimize things when you have the chance to optimize them. And so I would say different skill sets matter at different points in the product's journey. So I tend to skew more towards what does our product culture need now versus, hey, this is the bar at this company. So for example, if you have a product that has found fit, and you're just aggressively trying to grow market share or optimize the setup and onboarding or improve the conversion funnel or maximize the paywall, then you need somebody who's very quantitatively driven, right? Who can understand the core flow, break it down into the constituent parts, and then maximize each piece of it. But if you're generally trying to find fit, if you're trying to understand, from a collection of feedback from users, what matters to users, what might be people willing to pay for, you do need somebody who has more an intuitive sense of it. And so I always tell people, there are new and emerging products, there are scaling products, there are stable products, there are even products that need to be deprecated, and you need a different mix of qual and quant from your PMs at each state of the product's journey. And in fact, what happens a lot of times is if you put somebody who's very quant driven in an early stage ideation product, they're going to struggle. And if you put somebody who's very gut intuition based in a product that just needs to be optimized, they're going to struggle. And so partly it's the skills you hire for, partly it's the products that you tag them to work on.
Yeah, relying too much on one approach can really like create blind spots. Yeah, from your answer, I guess it's less about choosing one over the other and more about creating a culture where both perspectives are valued and like leveraged effectively and equally.
Absolutely. And that's why I think, in a healthy product culture, you not only have both types of thinkers, you have forums and rituals and tools where people can share both types of insights and debate, what is the truth or what is closer to the truth.
Yeah, true. My next question is, you introduced this concept of narrative metrics in your article. What exactly are those and how are they different from the usual numbers we track? And
yeah, I would say, when I think about the product decisions I've made in my, nearly 25-year career, or the decisions I've put in front of executives to get them to make, the most powerful avenue for getting decisions made is narratives. You have to tell people a story for why this is the right direction to go in. And so a lot of times, people will say, well, we're over indexing on one customer anecdote and this doesn't really represent the user base, but our CEO is very enamored with this idea and is pushing us for this, but the data says different. Why is that? It's because a customer story is a very powerful narrative, right? And even though it might just be one customer, that name, that persona, that empathy is really, really valuable to orient around. And so what I mean by narrative metrics is metrics that either construct a story or amplify a story or enhance a story or give you the ability to debate a counter story, right? And so I think a lot of times people look at metrics for looking at the sake of metrics, and they get really hung up on the operationalization of the metrics. Like, do we have data? Do we look at it once a week? Is it accurate? And those are important things, but they're not the main thing. The main thing is, what is this data telling us? Where are users going? Where are users struggling? Where are users finding value? And those can be interesting opportunities to then go find deeper discussions and construct more powerful narratives. And so that's what I mean by narrative metrics.
do you have any tips for teams who want to start using them?
I would say, it helps to start by putting aside a lot of the data you're measuring, because a lot of times when I am working with a team or inheriting a team or advising a team, they'll say we're measuring ABC metrics, and I'll say why, and usually the answer is because that's what I inherited. So there's not a lot of thought put into, but is this metric still useful, powerful to us as a tactic and a strategy? And so my advice to teams who are trying to get more adept at using narrative metrics is to say, go back to the drawing board and say, what are the stories you believe about your product and your market and your user? And then if you could, what metrics would really enhance that story? And then try to define those metrics. And a lot of times what happens is you then put aside some metrics you have been measuring, you introduce some new metrics, you then even come up with metrics that maybe are hard to measure, but you say this would be the most powerful metric, and then you can go back and sort of deconstruct it and say, can I come up with a proxy for that metric? Can I come up with something that is a leading or lagging indicator around that metric, right? So those are very, very powerful.
Yeah, I've noticed teams that embrace this kind of like thinking tend to build more human-centered products. And it makes me wonder about the challenges of the implementing like this approach. Is there a danger in becoming too reliant on qualitative feedback?
It is, because those stories can be so powerful. It's really easy to generate a bunch of them. You can talk to existing customers, you can talk to prospects, you can talk to churned customers, and you start to get all these stories. And in a way, it can become very confusing because you try to then figure out which of these stories is true. And the reality is they might all be true because your customer base has gotten big enough that you have discrete segments of people, right? So I don't know that the danger is relying too much on qualitative feedback. I think the danger is falling into narrative traps and not really applying rigor to that thinking. And so I would say, to me, it's less about qualitative alone. It's more, where are you making decisions where it's purely qualitative and you're not bringing in quantitative? Or where are you making decisions where you're assuming something at a micro level applies at a macro level, or something at a macro level applies at a micro level? So that's the kind of gut check I try to introduce. And so whenever there's qualitative feedback, I'm like, can we balance this out or challenge this with quantitative data? And if we're doing a bird's eye view, I want to know what the one user version of this is. And if it's a one user story, I want to know what the macro market version of this is. And so that's a way to sort of make sure you're not falling into any traps.
Yeah, how do you, in this case, like how do you prevent confirmation bias when collecting and interpreting user narratives, especially when they like might contradict what the data is telling you? Like how do you deal in those kind of situations?
Yeah, look, the first thing I would say is the way you conduct research, the way you reach out to users, the way you correlate and organize the questions, the way you synthesize the feedback, these are all opportunities to provide clarity or introduce bias, right? And so I think you want to make sure you, either as a data science team, as a market research team, as a user research team, have the best practices understood on how to prevent bias from creeping in, is number one. Number two is, I think you look back on the history of decisions you made, and you start to get better at understanding the good decisions, what was true about them, and then the bad decisions, what was true about them. So you can start to sort of round out or smooth out your blind spots, right? So that's another way I try to think about it. And then the last is, I think there are periods of product discovery, and then there are periods of product delivery. And so when you're in discovery mode, I think it's okay to make some bad calls potentially, because you're just in a learning mode. But where you're in a delivery mode, when you're trying to optimize a metric or optimize a KPI, decision quality is more paramount, right? And so I would say that's another thing I bring is, a lot of times organizations will have one rule book around making decisions with data and qualitative feedback, and they'll say, this is our playbook. But the reality is, if it's, one person evaluating your next product to build, and they're just doing some market ideation, let them go in circles for a little bit. That's not the end of the world, right? Versus if it's your core product and you're changing the core experience, and it's going to affect 99% of your users, and it affects your marketing copy on your website, you want to make sure you get that right. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm okay with dialing up or dialing down the rigor and intensity of the rituals based on the impact of the decision.
Yeah, that's a really smart way to look at it. Let's talk about like stakeholder management now. How do you effectively communicate product decisions when executives might prefer hard numbers while your decision might be heavily influenced by qualitative insights that don't translate like neatly into metrics?
Yeah. One of the things that I believe, and maybe not all product leaders believe, is product has to be fungible. Product has to be able to speak the language of many, many partners and stakeholders. So you have to get into technical depth with engineering. You have to speak customer lingo with go-to-market. You have to level up when you're working with executives. And I think a lot of times, a lot of product managers struggle because they're like, this is the language I'm speaking. Why don't you understand what I'm saying, right? And so you have to do a lot of the translation. That is partly the job of product, to live in that gray space and meet people where they are in their decisioning ability, right? And so what I try to do when that's going on in terms of communicating and collaborating with other people is try to frame it in terms of the context that they're going to understand. So the example you gave was, hey, there's some qualitative metrics, but people are interested in hard data. Anything qualitative can be turned into quantitative with a little bit of massaging, right? So, for example, one that I've used in the past is a sales team really has gotten good at selling their core product, but the company is trying to introduce new products and really wants to incentivize people with selling the new product. But they're trying everything with sales and it's not working. One thing you can do is kind of go look at deal notes, win notes, and look at competitive situations. And I did this at a previous company, and I saw that although there's no real quote unquote data around it, when I looked at the most competitive deals, ones that kind of came down to last minute and we didn't know if we were going to win or not, I saw that including the portfolio of products, the new products, was a differentiator cited by customers. Now, this was sort of buried in Salesforce in the deal notes. And so I manually went through and made a list of all the competitive wins over the last 1 year. And I highlighted, this is my signal on why we won, right? Is it superior product? Is it performance? Is it the breadth of the portfolio? And that portfolio approach appeared as the number one, like most common reason for winning. So then I was able to go back to the sales team and say, look, when you're in a competitive deal, there's a lot of differentiators you can bring, but one differentiator wins out more often than not. And that was me turning something that was qualitative feedback into quantitative to say, hey, 40% of the time this wins, and the next best differentiator is less than 10%. So this is your best weapon in this competitive landscape, right? And then that really educated and then motivated the sales team to say, we need to be talking about our full portfolio of products from the initial conversation, because that will prevent us from getting into these late stage competitive situations.
Yeah, that's a cool approach. Like how long did it take you to
I mean, if your user feedback, customer feedback is somewhat organized, we're talking about an hour or two of work, right? And you can do it the other way as well. Let's say you say, look, I have some really powerful data signal, but my executive is not going to believe it unless I can frame it in a customer narrative. That's when you use a product like UserPilot and you say, hey, look, what is the segment of customers that have seen this? Who are the users? Can I now go talk to these users individually, collect some anecdotes, and then which of those anecdotes has the most powerful quote, has the most powerful user research recording that I can share and say, look, this is what the data is telling us, and here's Brian at company such and such, right? That can also be really powerful. So I think you can go from quant to qual or qual to quant. And going back to my point about the job of product managers is to know when to translate in which direction, depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to my next question. Many companies claim to be data-driven, but in your experience, what are some warning signs that a company might be misusing or over-relying on data at the expense of like customer narratives?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, which is introducing bias. So you can introduce bias both on the qualitative side, but even on the data side. So for example, if you as a company have already decided what you want to do, you then go look at the metrics that make what you're doing seem good, right? You've already decided that there is a bias towards one direction versus another. And then you go look at that segment of users to say, yes, this is what's happening. And so I would say one of the things to watch out for is, there's obviously a data and insight sophistication curve that companies go through. And so level one is like, are you using any data, right? But from there, it's how often, how frequently, and what caliber of decisions are we using it. Level three is like, do you ever use it to unwind a decision, to change your mind about a decision, right? And then I think the most ultimate level is we're actually relying on the data to make the decisions for us most of the time, because we really trust in the quality and fidelity and accuracy of our data, right? Like we've established it as a ritual. And so I think it's important to know what level of maturity you are as a company, what level of maturity the people who are using the data have as well, and then slowly sort of working your way up the chain. I think a lot of times companies try to say they're data driven because mostly they want to attract talent that believes data driven decision making is better, right? But then that talent comes in and says, oh, the data pipeline is a mess, the tools are not used, the taxonomy is not governed, the rituals are not structured. And so I think you have to be honest with yourself about your degree of data drivenness and then have a plan for dialing it up. Again, I'll reiterate what I said earlier. Not every part of your product needs to be as data driven as every other part, right? One of the most common issues I've seen is when a company starts to grow and introduce new product lines, the people building the new products are always frustrated that they are held to the same data bar and standards as the core product. Because that core product should have a lot of data rigor around it, because rolling out the wrong feature, deprecating the wrong feature, messing up a core feature has a lot of impact in the core product. But with a new product, you're just iterating quickly to find product market fit. So I'm actually advocating for having a lesser degree of data rigor the earlier the product is.
Yeah, I've definitely been in meetings where we were like swimming in metrics, but somehow lost sight of the actual customer problem we were like trying to solve.
I mean, if you've not even written a line of code, why are you debating what the North Star metric is for that product?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes the teams like get hypnotized by conversion rates without considering the quality of engagement that happens after conversion. Yeah. So that's really a problem. Let's talk about like what's coming next. How do you think AI will change how we balance data and stories?
So the first is, I would say, for a long time, people had to choose like, oh, are you more data driven or are you more story driven? Then I think people had tools for both, but those tools were different sets of tools. So I think now a lot of those tools are starting to come together. So you kind of don't have to choose, right? You don't have to, your data science team does not need to be arguing with your user research team. They can be working off the same tool. I think what AI is going to do is, number one, remove a lot of the issues that led to unnecessary conflicts. So for example, I have a joke, half the time when you see a huge metric spike or dip, it's not anything you did. It's usually data error or seasonality. And so with AI, one of the simple things you can do is, if there are obvious reasons for the discrepancy or the anomaly, you know it quickly and you don't need to waste cycles. So I would say what number one thing I'm expecting from AI is productivity by removing unnecessary debates and discussions and investigations. That's number one. Number two, I would say, and this is where sort of the quality of decision making and the training with generative AI really comes in, is there's a lot of judgment in product decisions. It's like, this is what I think the data is saying, right? This is what I think the user meant. And I think as sort of AI co-pilots emerge and you really get sort of a data scientist in a box, that's going to be really powerful, because a lot of the tools historically have made it easier to offload level 0 work from data scientists. A lot of the reasons why data science and analytics teams love self-serve tools is they say, now I don't have to get involved in reporting a basic metric, creating a basic spreadsheet or a PowerPoint, right? I don't have to be in the basic metrics meeting. I can do the deep modeling work. I can do the segmentation work. I can find interesting trends that are not obvious. And now I think with AI companions, you should ideally be able to do that kind of forward-thinking data science work at everybody's fingertips. And then I would say the last one, and I haven't really seen this done yet, is I find it really powerful when I'm looking at a chart or looking at customer research. If I have an amazing data scientist or I have an amazing user researcher partnering with me, they really have a knack for slicing the data or asking the next question, right? Like if you've been sort of a shadow in a really good user interview, the researcher really just knows how to steer the conversation. If you've seen a data scientist in their environment, they really know how to segment the data in a way that you're like, oh, now it's obvious. I didn't see it when I was looking at it in aggregate, right? That's really hard to teach, right? And so it requires a lot of reps, and that's what these models can do, is they can sort of almost observe the patterns of research questioning or data slicing and segmentation and say, this is how I'm going to think and operate as well. So I think that's really the next frontier, is you're going to have companions that will say, I'm 80% confident this is what is about to happen. What do you want to do with that? And then eventually it will get to a point where it will even make the decisions for you. And I think PMs and product leaders will then just say, do I want to press the button and say yes or no?
Oh, that's a really interesting take. I hadn't thought about like AI as a bridge between these two worlds. And finally, my last question is, if there was one piece of advice you could give to product leaders who are struggling to find the right balance between data and narrative in their decision making, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say just be cognizant of how important being right is about that decision, because I've seen a lot of people wasting time and energy on artificial precision, and I've seen a lot of people shooting from the hip when they really need to get it right. And so I think rather than saying, hey, as a culture we strive for accuracy, or we go with our gut, you need to just say, what does this decision require of me? And that's another way of saying there are decisions that require the product leader to be intimately involved, and there are decisions that can be delegated to sort of the squad or pod level. And so that's my advice to product leaders, is insert yourself and introduce rigor and use qual and quant when required, and when not, like, save your time.
Ibrahim, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Let me just check the chat to see if we have any questions from the audience. Okay, I don't see any questions. Guys, if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. Okay, I guess we don't have any questions. Yeah. Thanks so much for breaking this down for us, Ibrahim. Your insights on juggling numbers and stories are super helpful. Do you want to add anything before we wrap up?
Just that I'm excited to see the tool set evolve to bring qual and quant together to introduce AI and honestly make it easier and faster for people to make quality decisions, because I think ultimately it makes product building teams more efficient, but then it actually makes products more delightful, which I think is great for consumers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ibrahim. I'll let you head backstage for now. Thank you so much. Cheers. And huge thanks to everyone watching. If you enjoyed today's chat, we have got tons more interviews ready to watch with some amazing product leaders like Akash Gupta, Maya Boe, Shivi Shi, and many, many others. I'll drop the link in the chat one more time. 1 second. Okay, here is the link. So just scroll to the PITT section and sign up for whatever looks interesting to you. So each one is packed with real world advice from people who have been there and done that. Until next time, keep innovating, and remember, the best product decisions happen at the intersection of numbers and narratives. Cheers. See you next time.